Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel says it launched 480 strikes in Syria. So the Israeli military said on Tuesday that it launched 480 strikes in Syria over 48 hours following the overthrow of former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, which Israeli media said marked the heaviest Israeli bombing of Syria in history. 480 strikes over 48 hours. So in 2 days, they really bombed the place. And the IDF said that it struck most of the strategic weapons stockpiles in Syria and estimated it destroyed between 70 to 80% of the former government's weapons. Israeli strikes hit targets across Syria, including the port of Latakia, which destroyed naval vessels. So the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the Israeli bombing campaign, quote, destroyed the most important military sites in Syria, including Syrian airports and their warehouses, aircraft squadrons, radars, military signal stations, and many weapons and ammunition depots in various locations in most Syrian governorates, end quote. So I haven't seen any reports of casualties in these strikes. It's not exactly clear. Those figures are not clear. So Israel also seized territory inside Syria, as we have covered, and that includes this buffer zone that separates the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights from the rest of Syria. But they've also gone beyond that zone, and sources told Reuters that Israeli forces advanced 10 kilometers into Syrian territory and were only 25 kilometers away from Damascus. Israeli sources denied that Israeli troops advanced that far into Syria, but Israel also announced that it was creating a sterile defense zone in southern Syria, framing the occupation as temporary. And I mentioned that the U.S. is backing this Israeli land grab, framing it, what is really an invasion of Syria, as self-defense, of course. So Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said, quote, together with the Prime Minister, I have instructed the military to establish a sterile defense zone free of weapons and terrorist threats in southern Syria without a permanent Israeli presence, end quote. So saying it's going to be temporary, but I'm sure some settlers already have their eye on this land. So Netanyahu put out a little statement on Tuesday claiming that Israel does not want to interfere in Syria's internal affairs, despite this massive bombing campaign and the land grab. He also threatened that Israel would take more action if the new government aligned with Iran, which is unlikely considering Jelani's in his victory speech, he criticized Syria for being close with Iran, the previous government. So Netanyahu said, quote, if the new regime in Syria allows Iran to establish itself or allows the transfer of Iranian weapons to Hezbollah, we will respond forcefully and we will exact a heavy price, end quote. So the Israeli leader previously took credit for the overthrow of Assad by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. That's the group leading this thing. That's the group in charge of Syria now. And Netanyahu celebrated the regime change. He prefers al-Qaeda guys to allies of Iran. They just a massive bombing campaign, and I don't think we're going to see Israel pull out of this territory that it's captured anytime soon. All right, so the next one here, new Syria regime forces carry out summary executions in Latakia. This article is from El Mayadeen. So I saw a lot of horrific videos going around on Twitter that were supposedly executions in Syria, mostly in Latakia, in Hama. I know some of them were the Turkish-backed groups. HTS is backed by Turkey, but not as overtly as these other groups. The Syrian National Army, I believe they were involved in some of these atrocities. so far, it doesn't look like things like this are happening in Damascus or Aleppo, but it's a sign that this could start coming to those cities. I know the Christians there are basically locked down in their homes, from how I understand it, and probably other minorities as well, in Damascus and Aleppo. And there hasn't been any sort of crackdown on minorities there yet, and let's hope that stays the case. But things are getting ugly in other parts of Syria. So a video circulating on social media shows armed Syrian fighters carrying out field executions of individuals they refer to as Shabiha, a derogatory term used to describe loyalists, in the village of Al-Rabia, located in the countryside of Latakia. The new regime forces military operations administration reported ongoing clashes in Al-Rabia, including the encirclement of a group of officers inside a fortified farm in the village. So there was some fighting going on, I guess, some remnants of the Syrian military. I know most of them just put on civilian clothes and walked away. So Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, he's going by a new name now, by the way, Ahmed al-Shara, which he claims is his real name, but he's been known as Jolani over all these years. He also said that, this is his quote, he said his forces, quote, will not hesitate to hold criminals, killers, and security and military officers involved in the torture of the Syrian people accountable. We will announce a first list of the names of senior figures implicated in torturing the Syrian people. Rewards will be offered for information about senior military and security officers involved in war crimes, end quote. And the Military Operations Administration in Syria announced Monday that its forces are close to completing the control of the capital, Damascus, and preserving public property. So the new government is starting to form, and that's the next one here. So there's not many details about these executions here, but these things are happening, again, for now in other parts of Syria, not in the major cities that HTS has taken over. Because, it's not like HTS controls all of Syria. You have the Kurds, the U.S. and the Kurds control eastern parts of eastern Syria, a good chunk of it, and then you have the Syrian National Army in the north and the northeast. So again, there's just all different factions still. All right, so the next one here, HTS-appointed Syrian Prime Minister begins work on transitional government. So this article's from The Cradle. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham appointed interim Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir. He's been tasked with establishing a transitional government following the swift collapse of deposed President Bashar al-Assad's government in Damascus over the weekend. So he said in a statement, quote, "The General Command has tasked us with running the transitional government until March 1st. End quote. The statement referred to Bashir as the new Syrian prime minister. Representatives of the Syrian Salvation Government, which ruled Idlib after it was conquered by HTS in 2015, met with representatives of the deposed government in the Council of Ministers in Damascus on Monday to discuss forming the new interim administration. So Bashir said that identical ministries, directorates, and institutions in Idlib and Damascus, such as the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Endowments, will be merged. Former Syrian Prime Minister Mohammed Ghazi al-Jalali said that he and a number of ministers were still in the country and had made contacts with the leadership of HTS to assist with the transition. So we will see how they are treated, this former prime minister and other ministers from the old government that stayed. A Syrian engineer and politician, Bashir served as prime minister of the Syrian Salvation Government from January 2024 until his new appointment Tuesday, and that was the HTS-led Islamist government in Idlib. So they're trying to get support from the West, trying to put on their best PR face here. Still, it seems like, but it's just really something that the U.S. is basically openly saying they'll support a government led by an al-Qaeda group. They prefer them to Assad and Iran. All right, so the next one here, Israeli attacks kill 34 Palestinians in Gaza. So Israeli strikes on the Gaza Strip overnight and on Tuesday killed at least 34 Palestinians, medics told Reuters, as the daily U.S.-backed slaughter continues. One Israeli attack targeted a house in Beit Hanun, northern Gaza, which has been under a total siege since early October as part of an ethnic cleansing campaign. Gaza's civil defense agency said that the strikes killed at least 25, including women and children, mostly members of the same family. In southern Gaza, 6 Palestinians were killed by various Israeli strikes around the city of Rafah. According to Wafa, the Palestinian news agency, at least 3 were killed by a drone strike that targeted a group of civilians. You see, this is the aftermath of strikes on the Nuseirat refugee camp in central Gaza. So on Tuesday evening, Israeli strikes targeted the Nuseirat refugee camp in central Gaza. The attacks killed at least 7 Palestinians, including 3 children and a woman. Gaza's health ministry said in its daily update, which it puts out about midday Gaza time, that at least 28 Palestinians were killed and 54 were wounded over the previous 24 hours. And that's a total, as I always mention, that counts bodies that are brought to hospitals and morgues. So their numbers are usually lower than what the rescue groups say. They'll factor in people who are dead under the rubble that they can't get to. But just, it continues every day, these horrific massacres. So many children being killed day in and day out. Just a complete destruction of the northern cities. That, you know, you see these videos that Israeli soldiers put out themselves of they're demolishing all the buildings in the northern cities of Beit Lahia, Beit Hanun, and Jabalia, where they're conducting the ethnic cleansing campaign just every day, and barely anyone seems to be noticing. All right, so the next one here, Israel attacks civilian home in northern Lebanon. So this article is from Jason Ditz. In the 2 weeks since the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire went into effect, Israel has launched an ever-growing number of attacks against southern Lebanon. These attacks have killed dozens of people, mostly civilians. Until today, these violations have been almost exclusively along the southern border. But overnight, Israel carried out an airstrike against a 3-story civilian home in northern Lebanon's Akkar province. Strikes this far north have been unusual, though not heard of, even before the ceasefire. Israel has provided no indication why it attacked this particular home. The bomb did not explode as intended and crashed unexploded into the building, causing considerable damage. Civilian homes were also destroyed in Israeli attacks further south, including the village of Kiam. All told, at least a dozen airstrikes have been reported against southern Lebanon towns and villages. And there's been artillery strikes as well and gunfire. So, they've just been flagrantly violating the ceasefire. As far as I know, Hezbollah fired 2 rockets last week toward Israeli positions. As far as I know, that's all Hezbollah has done. And Israel's just claiming that the ceasefire violations are based on Hezbollah's presence in the south, even though Hezbollah has the 60 days to withdraw. Now, airstrikes in the north, there's no excuse for that under the ceasefire and under the assurances that the U.S. gave Israel, that, the U.S. assured Israel that they could continue to bomb southern Lebanon if they felt the ceasefire was being violated, which that just gives Israel all the room that they need to do what they want. But strikes in the north, I don't get how they can even try to justify that after signing this deal. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. gives Ukraine $20 billion using Russian assets. So on Tuesday, the U.S. announced that it dispersed a $20 billion loan for Ukraine that will be paid back using interest earned on frozen Russian central bank assets, a step that marks an escalation of the Western economic war against Russia. The $20 billion is part of a total $50 billion loan being provided by the Group of 7 nations. The entire loan will be paid back using the Russian assets. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said in a statement, quote, "These funds paid for by the windfall proceeds earned from Russia's own immobilized assets will provide Ukraine a critical infusion of support as it defends its country against an unprovoked war of aggression." They're still using that term, unprovoked. The $50 billion collectively being provided by the G7 through this initiative will help ensure Ukraine has the resources it needs to sustain emergency services, hospitals, and other foundations of its brave resistance, end quote. So the Biden administration has been working to escalate its support for the Ukraine proxy war as much as possible before President-elect Donald Trump is inaugurated on January 20th, providing Ukraine with aid using Russian assets. So, a big problem with this is that this could make it more difficult to reach any sort of peace deal with Russia because they're going to want this money back. It's their money that the U.S. is stealing, that the G7 and the U.S. are stealing to pay for this big loan that they're taking out. I know Russia's saying they want sanctions to be lifted as part of any peace deal, so they're going to want their money back. And it's just like to do this at the last minute, again, when there's just no chance of Ukraine winning this war. I mean, it just goes to show how they're just desperate to keep this thing going and make it as hard as possible for some sort of deal to be made here. All right, so the next one here, Lukashenko says Belarus is hosting dozens of Russian nuclear weapons. So Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said on Tuesday that Belarus is hosting dozens of Russian nuclear weapons and is preparing to receive Russia's new intermediate-range hypersonic ballistic missile known as the Oreshnik. So Lukashenko said, quote, "I have deployed nuclear warheads here, several dozen warheads. Many say that this is a joke and no one has deployed anything. Yes, we did. And the fact that they say that this is a joke means that they have missed it. They overlooked how we brought them here," end quote. So he seems to be referring to Western officials who, I haven't heard them say this lately, but I remember after Russia said that it deployed nukes to Belarus, and Belarus said, yes, now we have Russian nukes, the U.S. was saying, oh, we don't have confirmation of that or something. So maybe that's what he's referring to. So Putin first announced in 2023 that he would deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus. He said it was in response to Western provocations and compared it to NATO's nuclear sharing program, which under that program, there are U.S. nuclear warheads deployed in Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, Belgium, and Turkey. Belarus has received nuclear-capable Iskander missiles. That's a short-range ballistic missile. And the Russian military helped upgrade Belarusian fighter jets so they could carry nuclear warheads. Lukashenko is now asking for Russia to deploy the Oreshnik missile to Belarus and said there's about 30 locations where they could be stationed. So this is the missile that Russia fired into Ukraine in response to the U.S. giving Ukraine the green light and Ukraine using the Attack missiles and the Storm Shadow missiles, the U.S. and British provided missiles in strikes in Russia. So in response, this was one of the responses, was test firing this missile. The Oreshnik that was fired into Ukraine was believed not to be carrying any explosives because there was very little damage. And Putin is saying that a conventionally armed Oreshnik missile could make nuclear weapons unnecessary because of he's saying it could carry such a big payload and, it fires multiple warheads. So it sounds like it packs a very strong hit if he's saying that it could make nuclear weapons unnecessary. Russia wouldn't even need to have the threat of using them for deterrence. I mean, he's making it sound like this missile can do some very, very serious damage with conventional warheads. All right, so the next one here, Yemen's Houthis attack U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Aden. So on Tuesday, U.S. Central Command said 2 U.S. Navy destroyers and 3 U.S. commercial ships came under an attack launched by Yemen's Houthis while transiting the Gulf of Aden. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, took credit for the attack, saying they targeted 2 U.S. destroyers that were accompanying supply ships. Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sarria said the attack achieved its objectives, while CENTCOM said the attack was defeated. No indication any of these missiles hit. CENTCOM said that the destroyers intercepted multiple drones and 1 cruise missile. It said, quote, "The reckless attacks resulted in no injuries and no damage to any vessels, civilians, or U.S. Navy or U.S. naval vessels," end quote. So a very similar thing happened just about 10 days ago. The Houthis launched a very similar attack. So you have these U.S. Navy destroyers. They've been escorting American merchant ships in the region. And, the U.S. Navy destroyers, their air defenses are incredibly advanced. But I feel like it's just a matter of time before a missile or a drone slips through. I know in one case, this was a while ago, way earlier in the year. I forget if it was a missile or a drone, but something the Houthis fired at a U.S. Navy ship made it past the initial layers of defense, and it was shot down by like their last layer of defense, which is basically just a machine gun that shoots at stuff and nothing that sophisticated. So it made it through the other more sophisticated defenses. So there's just always a risk, I think, of something slipping through here, some American sailors being killed or wounded, and then things escalating from there. But this just goes to show this whole thing has been a disaster, this bombing campaign that Biden launched in defense of Israeli shipping back in January. So we're coming up on a year of this bombing campaign against the Houthis. And if you know anything about Yemen, you would know that just a limited bombing campaign against the Houthis is not going to stop them. If anything, it's just going to escalate the situation, and that's exactly what it did. They started attacking American commercial shipping after that. They weren't doing that before. Biden launched this war in defense of Israeli shipping, and some senators even called him out on that's not a justification. So it's a completely unauthorized, illegal war, and it's done nothing but make the situation worse, cost billions of dollars. This is one of those things, I mean, people are barely talking about this, but, how is Trump going to handle this? Is he going to come in and just stop it? I don't know. I mean, by his history, he always brags about ISIS, how he, obliterated ISIS, even though they do still exist to some extent. But I mean, that was just like the U.S. just put a ton of air power behind a ground campaign that was mostly fought by the Kurds, the Shia militias, and Iran, and he just really bombed them. And what if he comes in and that's the attitude he has about the Houthis? What if he just thinks, oh, we'll just drop a whole bunch of bombs on them, see if that'll fix it? I wouldn't be surprised if that's his approach, because that's what he's done with previous conflicts. And it's just something that Yemen always just goes unnoticed. All right, so the next one here, China conducting major drills around Taiwan. So Taiwan said on Tuesday that mainland China deployed a large number of warships and planes around the island following Taiwanese President William Lai Ching-te's visit to the U.S. According to the South China Morning Post, Taiwan has monitored the most significant Chinese military activity in the area since China conducted a blockade drill around the island in October, which was a response to a speech from Lai. So Taiwanese officials also said China had deployed a total of 90 naval and Coast Guard vessels stretching from the South China Sea to southern Japanese islands. And this deployment is seen as an effort by China to show that it could not only blockade Taiwan, but it could also impede or block the U.S. and its allies from coming to intervene. China typically announces when it conducts major military drills, but so far, as of Tuesday night here in the U.S., I haven't seen an announcement from China, which again is kind of strange. Usually they announce these big drills. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Mao Ning, she was asked about these drills. She was asked, is China conducting military drills right now? And she said, I would refer you to other Chinese authorities for that answer. So Taiwan was anticipating major drills after Lai, the Taiwanese president, visited Hawaii and Guam during a tour of the Pacific region. China has a history of launching major exercises in response to contacts between U.S. and Taiwanese officials. Most infamously known at this point now is when Nancy Pelosi, when she was the House Speaker, went to Taiwan, and China launched huge drills around the island. They did their first blockade drills. Then they fired missiles over the island for the first time. So you see China really reacts to this stuff. And in recent months, we've seen China step up its warnings to the U.S. as the Biden administration has approved all these new weapon sales and military aid. And, what China does with these blockade drills around Taiwan, I mean, basically what they're telling the U.S. is, if we decide to take military action against Taiwan, it's not necessarily going to be an invasion. Look, we can blockade the island. Excuse me. And the drills have shown us, too, I mean, Taiwan's right off China's coast, so they could say, oh, we're doing drills and shutting down all these areas. And then all of a sudden they could say, all right, now we're enforcing a blockade on Taiwan. It could happen just as quickly as that. Not that I think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it just goes to show the ball is totally in China's court when it comes to Taiwan. The U.S. is not going to be able to defend that island, in any meaningful way, I don't think. But, you just never know. Well, who knows? Maybe one day China's going to make some demands and say, look, we're, blockading Taiwan now. But again, I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon. All right, so the next one here, Representative Mast to head the Foreign Affairs Committee. So this is an article from Daniel Larison's Substack. This is really bad news. Representative Brian Mast, Republican from Florida, best known for wearing his IDF uniform to Congress after October 7th. That's right, he volunteered with the IDF at one point in his life, and he decided to wear the military uniform of a foreign government to his job as a U.S. representative. And he's one of the sickest people. I know the Code Pink activists were, he got in some altercation with them, and they said, they were talking about Gaza. He said there's no innocent civilians. He's basically said that in Congress, that there's no innocent civilians. And he was confronted about the death of Palestinian children, about Palestinian babies, by Code Pink activists, and his response was, these are not innocent Palestinian civilians. And we had a story on it on antiwar.com. So again, he's just one of the worst of the worst here. So he's going to be the head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And this is thanks to Donald Trump. He was not expected to be in the running for this job. And it was a surprise, apparently, that he got it. But according to Jewish Insider, Trump lobbied members of the steering committee on Mast's behalf to put him over the top. So Trump had a role in this, according to these reports. And again, just one of the worst people. This Republican-controlled Congress, I think there's hope for Trump when it comes to ending the war in Ukraine. But when it comes to the Republican-controlled Congress, when it comes to Israel and Gaza, it's going to be horrendous. It's going to be such a nightmare. All right, so the next one here, the last story, survivor of the U.S. A-bomb recalls horrors in Nobel speech. So this article is from AP. A 92-year-old Japanese man who lived through the American atomic bombing of Nagasaki described on Tuesday the agony he witnessed in 1945, including the charred corpses of his loved ones and the ruins of his city, as he accepted this year's Nobel Peace Prize on his organization's behalf. The prize was awarded to Nihon Hidankyo, a grassroots movement of Japanese atomic bombing survivors who have worked for nearly 70 years to maintain a taboo around the use of nuclear weapons. The weapons have grown exponentially in power and number since being used for the first and only time in warfare by the United States on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in 1945. So let's see. Let me just read what he was talking about. I know one of these guys, one of the survivors mentioned something about Gaza, and like Israeli officials went after him about it. But anyway, sorry, I got a little lost here. I just wanted to talk about his story, his day in Nagasaki. So Tanaka is his name. He described the attack on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, 3 days after the first bomb was dropped in Hiroshima. He recalled the buzzing sound of a bomber jet followed by a bright white light and then an intense shockwave. 3 days later, he and his mother sought out loved ones who lived near the hypocenter. He said, quote, "Many people who were badly injured or burned but alive were left unattended with no help whatsoever. I became almost devoid of emotion, somehow closing off my sense of humanity and simply headed intently for my destination," end quote. He found the charred body of an aunt, the body of her grandson, his grandfather on the brink of death with severe burns, and another aunt who had been severely burned and died just before he arrived. In all, 5 family members were killed. So just absolutely horrific. And he talks about his efforts to try to abolish nuclear weapons for the sake of humanity. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder, the Syrian rebellion, who are the big losers? One from Daniel Larison, leave Syria alone. I certainly agree with that sentiment. Nick Cleveland Stout, a billionaire tied to shady military ops, could be number 2 Pentagon pick. One from Jacob Hornberger, why Ukrainian soldiers are deserting. And one from James W. Carden, how the neocons won the transition. So please go check all of that out. You can always support this show by sharing it. Like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff helps. Follow us on Instagram. Follow us on X. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.